Get this. A 78-year-old man was fined and jailed by the government for creating ponds on his own property. Now that man is dead, and his widow struggles in the courts to stop the politicians and bureaucrats from continuing to try to take nearly $130,000 from the estate. Perhaps you'll agree that this breaking story is something that the great Rod Serling himself would have said belongs in the Twilight Zone. Hi everyone, I'm Gardner Goldsmith for MRC-TV, and allow me to lay this situation out for you. As Matthew Vadum writes for the Epoch Times, U.S. Navy veteran Joseph T. Robertson languished in prison for a year and a half for digging fire protection ponds near his home outside Basin, Montana, without Federal Clean Water Act permits. He used to operate a business that supplied water trucks to firefighting agencies. Robertson was also fined $130,000. In November of 2018, he asked the Supreme Court to look at his conviction after it was upheld by the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. Now, for those embracing the principles of freedom and private property, that is enough. Robertson created ponds on his land. According to British common law and the Lockean natural rights theory on which U.S. tort law are based, he was supposed to be able to freely do anything he wanted with his property as long as he didn't bring direct harm to the life or property of another person. But the faceless bureaucracy of the United States government is nothing short of a Twilight Zone nightmare. And thanks to Richard Nixon's Environmental Protection Agency, Robertson was attacked himself by the government. He and his wife are the victims here. Robertson unexpectedly died on March 18th at age 78. But on April 15th, the Supreme Court quietly granted Robertson's petition without even proceeding to the oral argument phase. The High Court vacated the judgment of the Ninth Circuit, remanding the case to the Circuit Court to consider whether the case is moot at this point. Weeks before that, the Supreme Court agreed to substitute the petitioner's wife and representative of his estate, Carri Robertson, as petitioner in place of Robertson. And now the Ninth Circuit will have to decide whether his widow, Mrs. Robinson, and her lawyer, Tony Francois, will be able to absolve themselves from having to pay this ridiculous fine. Quote, Francois said in coming days he will file a motion in the circuit court to have the convictions of his client vacated and the fine abated. When a person convicted of a crime dies without the appeal process having completely run its course, the conviction is normally vacated. But it is unclear what position the government will take. Even if the convictions are dismissed, the fine could remain, in which case the controversy may yet find its way back to the Supreme Court, Francois explained. And you know, all of this might thrill political pedants who like to sow and reap vast landscapes of laws and bureaucracies and statutory structures, the rules of which fill reams of legal volumes, but of course harden the arteries of anybody who has a clear mind and a freedom-loving conscience. Peaceful people, the kinds of people whom Mr. Serling defended on the Twilight Zone.
Any state, any entity, any ideology that fails to recognize the worth, the dignity, the rights of man, that state is obsolete. A case to be filed under M for Mankind in the Twilight Zone.
But you know, this sort of situation with a federal agency created by stretching the Constitution far beyond its original intent, about which we were warned by James Madison, a federal agency claiming the power to control your private property and take and give as it pleases. Can you imagine that the founders of this country would have ever thought that the federal government could have gotten that bad? It is like a dystopian future.
This is not a new world. It is simply an extension of what began in the old one. It has patterned itself after every dictator who has ever planted the ripping imprint of a boot on the pages of history since the beginning of time. It has refinements, technological advances, and a more sophisticated approach to the destruction of human freedom. But like every one of the superstates that preceded it, it has one iron rule. Logic is an enemy and truth is a menace.
And yet it exists today, and a woman is fighting it right now. Indeed, if Rod Serling were alive today, could this be an introduction for the Twilight Zone? Submitted for your approval. The plight of one woman against a faceless bureaucracy, which does not care hide nor hair about her property or the wishes of her deceased husband. A woman who fights for her rights to her property and her husband's legacy. It certainly could exist against that faceless bureaucracy, and it's no longer in the Twilight Zone. Thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe for MRC-TV. I'm Gardner Goldsmith.